Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first German-Israeli podcast here on Schmutz. My name is Amit, greeting you from Tel Aviv, Israel.
And my name is Nicholas from Germany, but currently I live in Vienna. Very warm welcome from my side.
So here on Schmutz, we're going to talk about anything and everything geopolitics. We're going to analyze current political affairs from a geopolitical perspective, from a classical liberal perspective, even a conservative perspective. We talk about anything and everything. And here on Schmutz, nobody is safe from our criticism and our scrutiny. So be prepared, it's going to be a lot of fun. This is an attempt for us to try and talk about the things that interest us as friends and as political scientists on a podcast. If this goes well, then we would really like to expand this into many more topics that have to do with current affairs around the world and international relations. But on the first episode of Schmutz, we're just going to introduce ourselves, tell you, the viewers, what this is about, what we're going to do, and a little bit about Schmutz itself. So maybe, Niklas, you can start by telling us, what does Schmutz mean?
Sure. So firstly, I want to say this is, in fact, the first German-Israeli podcast. And, you came up with the idea. I came up with the name. So I think it's going to be a wonderful occasion. And the last thing is now we have to invite some annoying guests that we can make this podcast perfectly. Schmutz, yeah, as you mentioned, we want to talk about politics, about foreign policy, about diplomacy, about peace and conflict studies. And most of the time, these topics are not very nice. These topics are quite bloody, dirty. And that's the reason why we choose the name Schmutz. Schmutz is a German name. And we found it's quite appropriate to the topics we want to talk about. Schmutz, as I said, is a German term, but you can also find it in Hebrew. Also in America, when you go to some streets in New York, people will understand what Schmutz means. And that's the reason why we choose this name. Mostly about the topics we want to talk about. It's about foreign policy and about German-Israeli politics. And to start this podcast, I want to ask Amit, you, who are you and what encouraged you to start this podcast? So tell me a bit about yourself, please.
The other day, Niklas and I, first of all, we are very good friends, and we have a lot of conversations about the things that are happening in the world, and we are both people who have a lot to say. We aren't really subscribed to any ideology. We are not really groupthink kind of people. We are very analytical, and we have a lot of conversations about things that are happening in the world. And I always thought that it would be really interesting for other people to hear what we're talking about. And then the other day, I was just thinking to myself, you know what? Maybe next time we talk on the phone or we have a conversation or a chat, we should just record it and put this on the internet as a podcast. And just like a married couple, I wasn't expecting to get a yes when I was asking, hey, let's record ourselves doing it next time. But Niklas actually said yes, and that's the craziest thing here. And then within a day, we already had a script and like a program for a few shows. And this has been going faster than I had expected. And now we are here trying out the first show. And it's definitely going to be interesting. And I think that we have a winner on our hand, and we need to play our cards correctly and see where we can get here with it. So I think, first of all, before we talk about the real content of the podcast, which is geopolitics, I'd like to get to know you, or I'd like to have the viewers get to know you, Niklas. So Niklas, you were born in Germany. You've lived there all your life, or most of your life, but you've done something unique that not many Germans have done, and that is that you served in the military, and a long time as well. So maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are, what pushed you to a military service in Europe in 2020.
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, I grew up in northern Germany, and in comparison to Israel, which is a quite difficult land and quite, it's a war zone and it's not comparable what we experience here in Europe. But I grew up in northern Germany, and normally in Germany, after you finish high school, most of the students are decided to take a gap year. Most of them are joining or going for work and travel to Australia. Well, mostly traveling on daddy's card, but that's another thing.
Yeah.
And no, from my side, when I finished my high school, my dad came to me and said, "What are you going to do?" And said, "Oh, do the same. Work and travel and go to Australia." And said, "I'm not going to pay for you." And then I realized, okay, now I have to make to gain my life by myself. And I decided to join the military. Yeah, better to say I joined the Navy for 3 years. Well, not as a voluntary, but also as an officer. I joined the Naval Academy, where I received my officer training, where I got commissioned as an officer, and where I got a very wonderful time in the military. And yeah, it was, from my side, it was a very cool experience. And perhaps that was the reason why Amit and we both interact very nice and very, very good talking about politics, because we have on many topics, we've got similar ideas. And yes, that's the reason. And I want to ask you about something about you. At the age of 17, you left Israel to go to Germany instead of joining the IDF, because what I know that most of the students are in charge after they finish high school. It's time to get drafted and serve in the IDF, right? Isn't it?
Yeah, that's interesting, because we've essentially switched sides here. So like, you as a German, you did the military for 4 years, and I as an Israeli went to school first. So I graduated, the story is that I graduated school when I was 17, so rather young. And I wanted to do something unique, just like you wanted to do something unique. I wanted to do something that not many people do. And since I'm half European, so my dad's family are from Europe, I also have a European passport. And I was thinking to myself, I'm still young. I still have time until 18 when I have to join the military. Why don't I go to Europe and try my luck and see where this can get me? So with a recommendation of a friend, I moved to a city in southern Germany. And I wanted to learn German and maybe work a little bit and just see where this can get me, have a small little adventure before the military service. But then COVID came. It actually hit a few months after I had moved to Europe, and the borders closed and I couldn't travel back so easily. And my draft got delayed and delayed again and delayed again and delayed again. And I ended up staying in Germany for 6 years. Until I was actually released from the army. I was not required to do it anymore because the draft had got delayed so many times. After like a couple of months in Germany, and I realized I was not coming back, I just decided to join a study program at the university in the city where I was living. And this is the program that I graduated and now took back to Israel, where I completed my military service as an academic. My role was not related to academia, but I did join up in the end as a volunteer. And I met Niklas on university. And we, like he said, we both have a very similar view on things. And this is what eventually brought this podcast to life. So now that I've told you about my experience in Germany, one very interesting aspect is that for me as an Israeli, Germany is a country that we mostly hear about in like history class in school. And obviously for me, visiting it for the first time was like a bit of a culture shock, because it was very different from many of the things I had heard about. Obviously, I mostly heard about historic Germany. I didn't know much about modern Germany. But modern Germany has struck me basically as the antithesis, or like the polar opposite of historic Germany. And I'd like to address the elephant in the room and ask you as a German, what is the mood nowadays in Germany when it comes to, obviously, your history? What is Germany's relationship to Israel, to the Jewish people? Obviously, we're doing a German-Israeli podcast, and I think this is something important that we need to get out of the way first.
I totally agree with you. And I think, as you mentioned, the German-Israeli relationship is something very, very special. It's extraordinary world in case of history about the atrocities that are committed during the Second World War, about the horror 80 years ago. And nowadays, I would say, we are a democracy since 75 years, and the Federal Republic is now a democracy. It is embedded in the Western society. We have one of the strongest and most strongest democracies in the West. And in regard to see Israel, I would say that we see Israel firstly as a partner with a deep sense of historic responsibility. And we see Israel's security as part as our moral and political identity, I would say. We cannot, guarantee Israel's security. You have to buy own, and your strongest foreign suppliers are United States. And of course, America is perhaps the most important partner for Israel. But in case of a symbolic support and symbolic protection, I would say that Germany plays a very, very important role in that. And we have this common history, and I think it's a very good one. And we see it that from year to year, we can see a certain kind of strengthening and improvement of our both countries, in case of a relationship. Or what do you think?
I think this is a very interesting point, and I think that we can easily dedicate a full episode to this. The German-Israeli relationship, again, me as an Israeli, how I experienced it, again, it was radically different from what I had expected. Coming to Germany, so I haven't mentioned it, but my first time in Germany, I was on a school exchange in Saxony in 2015, if I remember correctly, in a little village, very conservative area. And one thing I had felt, which made me a little bit uncomfortable, was actually that many German people were really apologetic towards Jewish people or towards Israeli people. And one thing that I strongly believe is that you should never apologize for something that you didn't do. You should never apologize for a history that you didn't take part in. But this was a very interesting experience for me. But then I moved to Southwest Germany. And again, one important thing that I need to say is that my whole experience in Germany was during a very turbulent decade, right? So my first time there was in 2015 during the refugee crisis. And then I moved in 2019, shortly before COVID. And then obviously 2022, the Ukraine war hit. So there have been a lot of crises in Germany, and it's a society that, in my opinion, has been changing quite rapidly. But nevertheless, when I moved to southern Germany, I experienced something quite different from what I had experienced in East Germany. I experienced a more critical environment, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. But this did make me question, you asked about the German-Israeli relationship, this did make me question a little bit where this relationship is going. I don't think that Germans delegitimize the existence of the State of Israel, but I did have a feeling that Germans are becoming more and more estranged of Israel, with some Germans even seeing it as I say some, a very big some, because it's not many. It's a vocal minority or a not so vocal minority even see Israel as the projection of the crimes that had been committed by Germany in the Second World War. And I'd like to ask you now, because I feel like, I lived in a very liberal area in Southwest Germany, and I saw a very conservative area in the East. I lived in Berlin for a little bit, but aside from that, I really have no knowledge of German society or of the country. And I'd like to ask you, on broader terms, how do you feel like, what do you think is the role of Jewish nationalism or Zionism, or call it however you want? How is it viewed in Germany? What's the significance of it? Should Germany even care about it? How do you see this, and what's your personal experience with those things?
Well, I just can give my personal opinion, and this is pretty much the same as the German government is going to support since many, many years. But now, as you mentioned, we can see a certain kind of change towards this relationship, especially in some protests and some demonstrations. But this is not quite a German phenomenon. I mean, we can see it in many Western countries. In France, you saw the entire demonstrations in many campuses in Paris, at Columbia University, in Berlin as well. So that's a very difficult question. Let me begin, for example, after the 7th of October, after the Hamas attacked, I would say that the German society were pretty strongly supported Israel after these atrocities and after these horrible attacks. But after the war continued and continued and continued, there was certain kind of change towards the perceptions in Germany and also in the West about the wars and about the bombardments. And this is quite a strange thing, I would argue. Nowadays, we see this huge supports at universities about pro-Palestine demonstrations. And to be honest, I'm totally against this kind of demonstrations. Well, I'm in great favor of human rights and demonstration in case of against wars. But to be honest, when person assemble and gathering towards undemocratic flags and walking under the Palestine flag, I have absolutely no sympathy for them if people are living in the West. To be honest, it's a thing which I totally disgrace. And about Zionism, well, I never studied Judaistic, or I'm not familiar about Jewish religions or Jewish traditions. But as long as I know, when I came to these demonstrations and I came in contact with a girl, and there was a big banner about the anti-Zionist entity and blah blah blah, the Zionist entity. And I say, okay, let's be honest. So what's the definition of Zionism? So what do you consider that? And I was thinking, okay, Herzl or the definition of Rabbi Abraham Koch or something, and she looked me like a car, and she has absolutely no idea about these definitions. And I said, okay, perhaps 76 different definitions of gender, but can't give me 2 definitions of Zionism. And I think the dilettantic role in this kind of academic chatter is something which is deteriorated from day to day. So the level of the academia or the protest is very, very low in these demonstrations. What do you think?
First of all, I have a lot of thoughts, and unfortunately I don't have a pen and a paper in front of me to write down everything that I want to say. First of all, what you said about the 76 gender identities is very beautifully put. It's actually relating to a thought that I've been having for a while, that, the European and American left are the champions of manipulating definitions. They can take a very binary definition like gender. You can argue that gender is not the same as sex, but whatever, I will not even get into that debate. Take a very binary definition as gender and make it scientific that there are over 70 genders. Obviously, that's not to say that people are not allowed to call themselves whatever they like. I mean, this is obviously something that we stand for here on Schmutz. But the left is really big on definitions and on manipulating definitions. But when it comes to things like Zionism or anti-Semitism, they are really, I feel like something that you see in the academic left. My experience even on a German university, something that I saw on the academic left is that they are really not open to broaden their definitions of Zionism. That Zionism can mean maybe just definitely a Jewish movement for self-determination, even an anti-colonial movement, right, of Jews returning to their historic homeland, or another thing where they really are not willing to broaden the scope of the definition even a little bit is anti-Semitism. So for them, anti-Semitism is the act of hating somebody because he or she celebrates Hanukkah. But it's so much more than that, obviously. But then again, we're going to have a dedicated episode for anti-Semitism, old and new, and I'm going to save up the ammunition for that one. But I would like to ask Nicholas, so you have mentioned that many of these protesters have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. They haven't been to Israel, they haven't been to the Middle East, but you have, and this is something very interesting. Do you want to tell me a little bit about your experience in the Middle East, in Israel?
Absolutely. So I had a very, very cool experience in Israel. The first time I visited Israel was 2 years ago. It was before the attack of the 7th of October. And to be honest, I was quite reluctant, my first contact in Israel, because, in case of history, for example. But after a couple of hours, I was pretty embraced by the Israeli society. They're very, very warm people, very nice people.
What do you mean by reluctant?
Reluctant, it's different, for example, to go to Israel than go to France or to Spain. Do you understand?
Is it because you had a prejudice against Israel, or is it because you felt some sort of guilt?
I don't have prejudice against Israel, but I think the Israelis had prejudice against the Germans. It's the
Did
opposite.
did you feel that in Israel when you
No,
visited?
totally not. It was the totally opposite about that. No, the Israelis are very nice, very, very warm people. And I had a very wonderful experience there. I was traveling there around many cities. I see Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Haifa, and it was very beautiful. And and what I realized, for example, when the Germans, it's totally opposite that. They're very popular in Israel. And I was reading a survey, and I think the most populous tourists or foreigners in Israel are firstly the Americans, and secondly the Germans. And I was quite wondering about that, but I think on the German side we don't have this kind of service. But I think that in regards of our relationships, there's a strong improvement of German-Israeli relationships, and I think they made a very good job nowadays. Yeah, we have many student exchanges, we have many cultural exchange programs. Many Israelis who are visiting Germany and Berlin. There's a huge Israeli community in Berlin, and many Germans who are visiting Israel on the other side. So I think it's a wonderful thing. And yeah, now Amit, please can you tell me about your experience in Israel? Right, to be honest, you grew up in a war zone, which is totally different than growing up in Europe or North America. Can you tell me something about the experience you made, or what does it mean for you growing up in Israel? About your daily experience?
First of all, I'd like to refer to one of the points that you've made earlier, and it's that you feel like Germans are very popular in Israel, and I had mentioned earlier that I felt that in the southwest of Germany, there is a lot of criticism of Israel. And honestly, I feel like this is actually a very positive, maybe not entirely positive, but it's a positive development because it shows that both of our people are moving on from what had happened in history. So it means that the Israeli people are warming up or have already warmed up to the idea of being friends with Germans, being friends with Germany as a country. And the German people don't feel this immense guilt that they cannot criticize anything that Israel is doing, which is obviously also wrong. Nobody is above criticism, and anyone should be allowed to criticize anything they want, so long as it's not hateful, right? So yeah, and then to your question of what is it like to grow up in Israel? Look, this is something that I guess you can agree with me on because you visited the country. But one thing that I always say to friends from other countries, international friends who ask me what is Israel like, I always repeat this one point that Israel is not similar to anything else. It's really not similar to anything you've ever seen. It's the kind of country where you really have to go there to understand what it means and what it is. And I think that part of it is because although it's a melting pot, although you have people from all over the world coming into Israel, culturally and also geographically, it's quite isolated from the world. And it's really, you mentioned earlier that German tourists and American tourists are very popular in Israel. And I don't know the statistic, but I can definitely believe you. And the reason for that is that Israeli people are very curious about people who come from the outside. We have a term, we call it a man of the world or a woman of the world, and it's because Israeli society is kind of like a closed bubble. It's very defined by the army. It's very defined by, kind of like where your family came from, what degree of religiosity you have in your family or in your background. And it kind of lives on its own rules that are very separate from other countries. And I think that this is one of the reasons that I find it so problematic when critics of Israel, always compare it to awful boogeymen from the past, like apartheid or Nazi Germany or this or that. This is really not a country that you can compare to anything else. And for me, growing up there, the bottom line is that despite being a very unique place, my childhood was probably very similar to that of Niklas, because one very important point for us Israelis is, there is the slogan, the British slogan from World War II, this keep calm and carry on. Is that no matter what happens, we have to allow normal life and developed life to carry on. Kids go to school, adults go to work, everything works, public transport works, infrastructure is good, salaries are good, no matter what's happening outside. We have a very European standard of living despite everything that's happening. And I'd like to ask Niklas, what do you think about this? Like, is that how you experienced Israel as well, or did you feel some differences or similarity or other similarities with Europe?
I mean, sure, it's a totally different country, and in regard of a history, I mean, it's the only Jewish state in the nation or in the world. Well,
Not
according
exactly.
to the
Not exactly.
not exactly, yeah,
Yeah.
we learned something about the Jewish oblast in Russia. But it's the biggest Jewish nation, of course, in the world, and yeah, it's something which is totally in the society, of course. When people ask me and ask me, so for example, are you Jewish? I say, oh. I mean, they're taken for granted. They ask you if you're Reform or an Orthodox. I say, no, I'm Protestant. But no, it's a very, very wonderful thing, yeah. And as you mentioned it, and I cannot agree more, that it's a very peaceful environment. It's a very normal society, but within that very hostile environment about your neighbors, yeah. And it's a daily thing that you have got drone attacks there. You've got rocket attacks from foreign countries, from Iran, from Lebanon, from the Gaza Strip. And this is a very, very extraordinary thing. Yeah? And this was what I also want to ask you about your experience there. So when October 7th occurred, you were in Israel, you were in Germany. Can you tell me something about your feelings during that time, perhaps, when you were there and your family was there?
Well, I have so many things to say. A very good question. I'm thinking that maybe I should actually start off from what going through war in Israel is like, because as you've mentioned, it's very different from how you experience life in Europe. Despite being overall a very functional country, we are still a small country that is very threatened by many of its neighbors and also distant neighbors. And maybe it would be good to first describe a little bit what going through war in Israel is like. So, I remember that one of my earliest memories is that, there was the Gulf War, second Gulf War between the US and Iraq when they wanted to finally remove Saddam Hussein from power. And obviously Saddam Hussein didn't have weapons of mass destruction or any weapons actually that could reach the United States. So he targeted the nearest ally of the United States, which is Israel. And one of the earliest memories that I have is that we had a very big concern about chemical warfare at the time, because he had allegedly been developing or using chemical weapons. To this day, we don't know how true this is. And I have a memory that my parents were sealing the windows of our old apartment with this like plastic foil that was supposed to prevent the gas from getting in. And we had soldiers from Homefront Command come into our houses and hand out, and we call these protective gears, which was essentially a gas mask. And I had a unique gas mask for children, which I was taking to kindergarten with me. And why this memory is so strong is because I was 3 years old, I think, and I don't remember the conflict itself, but I do remember the fear. When your parents are scared and you're a child, it's something that you really feel. And that was my first experience in war. In the end, we didn't have any missile strikes. We didn't have any chemical weapon attacks. So that didn't happen, luckily. But still, this really tense atmosphere of something's going to happen, that was not fun. Then when things really did happen, it was my 12th birthday, 2012. There was a limited ground operation in Gaza, and they were firing on my city. At that point, we didn't have Iron Dome. So the Iron Dome is the missile interceptor of Israel. And at that time, the success rate of missiles from the Gaza Strip was higher, the penetration rate. But then the biggest conflict was 2014. But then we had the Iron Dome, and I remember that I had spent the entire summer vacation in the bunker in my parents' apartment. And the funny thing is that you don't see much destruction because you have very developed defense systems, and overall life carries on as usual. And what I remember from that summer vacation is actually that it was one of the most fun times of my life, because I had this one friend, he was my neighbor. He would come to my place, and we would sit in the bunker and play Minecraft like LAN all the time. And it's a very, I don't want to talk too much about past wars, but it's a very different experience to, the wars that are happening in other countries, because despite what's happening on the outside or in the sky or on the Gaza Strip or in Lebanon or wherever, we still live a very normal life alongside this. And I think that the best comparison I can draw is probably the pandemic times in Europe, but after the restrictions were loosened. So it was no longer in this panic crisis mode. It was more like you live alongside it and you can have your daily life with some disruptions. But October 7th, it was different. And I'm getting back to your question. I'm sorry for the lengthy introduction, but this is important. You asked me about October 7th. October 7th is a different one. Because this is, I think, since 1973, it's the first invasion. It wasn't a terrorist attack. It was an invasion of the state of Israel, a violation of the autonomy of the state of Israel, of the sovereignty of the state. And you're right, at that time I was living in Germany. I was on the third year of my degree, 3 out of 4, just entering my fourth year. My life was very, very settled in Europe. I had felt, at that point, I had been in Europe for almost 5 years. I had felt super assimilated. I wasn't really even considering going back, at least not soon. And then one day I woke up, I like to sleep in. I woke up at 12 p.m. and I see a message from my mother, a war has broken out. And I was thinking, okay, a war, we've lived through this. It's not that dramatic. And suddenly my friends, it was 12 p.m., so it had already been a few hours into the attack. My friends started to send me videos and pictures of what was going on inside of Israel. So like pickup trucks with like terrorists snatching kids from their homes and their beds inside of Israel, not so far from Tel Aviv. And then I understood that this was something else. And one thing I would say is that I had gotten really so much support, especially me personally, not me as an Israeli, me as Amit. The first week of the war, I had gotten messages from every single person that liked me in Freiburg or in Europe, people that I didn't even remember. They would send me messages with condolences about the attack. But then the mood shifted rather quickly. And that was, for me, the most traumatizing part, to see, the place that you live in, that you call home, become so fixated on what's going on in your real home and also turn against you. So this was very long. I'm sorry for I'm sorry for the monologue. But, Nicholas, you were supposed to come visit me this summer. And it unfortunately didn't take place because of the Iranian attack. And at that time I was in the military, and I remember I had gotten some inside information that something big was going to happen. And it was a few days before your flight. And I couldn't tell you anything, but obviously I kind of warned you not to come. And this was, again, a very different kind of war, a very major kind of war. And I'd like to ask you, how did you experience this in Germany? Because this was obviously different. It's Israel fighting a country, not Israel fighting Gazans. What was the sentiment regarding the recent Iranian war?
I was watching a lot of news during that time because, as you mentioned, I want to visit you and our common friend Tomer. So welcome from this side, Tomer. And yeah, of course, I was very not excited, but very interested about the events that occurred during that time. And I totally agree. I mean, this war was different. I mean, then it was not a war against a terror organization. It was an asymmetric war, was like Iran, and against the nuclear program of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And yeah, it was totally different. And I was very frightened about that. Iran is going to start something which is out of their mind. Yeah. And yeah, I was very concerned during that time. Yeah, that's true. But we postponed it, and hopefully I'm going to see you next year. And Tomer again. Hello, Tomer. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think it's like a window of opportunity which you have to see in Israel. And it's as you mentioned, it's a war zone. And
even if it doesn't feel like a war zone,
perhaps it remains a war zone. I'm not a prophet, but it could be possible. Absolutely. But that's the topics what we're going to talk about. Yeah, Schmutz and wars. Yeah, that's true.
So if you, the listeners, like this kind of concept, like this kind of talk, then obviously we have a lot more coming. This was just a little taste of what we are planning for you. Like we said, nobody is safe here on Schmutz, and so far it's a lot of fun. Like it's pretty good discussion topic. Okay, so now that we've talked quite a bit about conflicts in the Middle East, I would also like to talk about conflicts in Europe, which is a fairly new thing for our generation. In 2022, as we know, Russia invaded Ukraine for seemingly no reason. We've both studied this deeply, and I still don't really understand why. And, the hardship that the Ukraine war is bringing is definitely felt in Germany by ordinary citizens. And I'd like to ask you, as a NATO officer, first of all, what's going on? Where is this heading? And also maybe tell me and the viewers, why did this all start? Because this is something that I don't fully understand.
Well, yeah, NATO officer, but not an active duty, just in a reserve. But yeah, so I try to keep it very, very short because this is just our pilot episode. But I would say that foreign policy and military politics is now back on the table now in European politics and European defense politics. Over the last couple of 30 years, we were much more evolving into, multilateral worlds towards mutual liberal agreements, and this kind of Cold War episode was occasionally over after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the defeat of the Soviet Union. And yeah, now after Russia started its war against Ukraine, we can see we've got a huge shift in foreign politics, and we can see it in many countries. So Germany is a special way and a special example for that. Now German politics is now about the reintroduction of compulsory military service. We're talking about conscription. We've got a huge...
Which is crazy.
Which is
I'm sorry for interrupting.
Totally crazy, yeah.
It's crazy because Germany is a demilitarized country, and the whole modern German ethos is that it's a peaceful nation.
Well, we're not demilitarized, but the reputation of the military was very, very bad for many years. It has a lot to do with the reputation of the German military after the Second World War. It has a lot to do with the foreign deployments in Afghanistan, in Mali and towards, and it was not very interested in the society in Germany, what the Bundeswehr, what the German military is doing in these countries. Yeah, but now we can see a shift back about the actual target of the actual command aim of the German military, and this is like deterrence politics and about the defense politics in NATO. And we have to defend NATO. Our Article 5 is the heart of the NATO contract. We stand for each other. Each NATO country stands for each other. And yeah, and I think all European countries has realized the danger and the importance that now the military is back on the negotiation table. Yeah. And yeah, we've got a huge amount of troops right now. The British have got their troops in Estonia. The Canadians have their troops in Lithuania. In Latvia, the Germans have a troop in Lithuania, the Americans in Poland, and we try to secure the east flank of NATO right now. And yeah, so as you mentioned, yeah, security politics is back on the table now. And yeah, perhaps it's a different one like in Israel, but it plays a very decisive role right now in international politics, yeah, no doubt.
Why did the Ukraine war start? What is give me a conclusive summary.
It has many things to do. I would argue that the foreign policy of Russia has a lot to do with the Primakov doctrine, that Russia is going to strive for its old empire dreams, that they are looking for a strategic alliance with the Chinese, that they're trying to push out the Americans out of Europe, which we can see on the Trump administration in certain ways, that America is now focusing more on China and the Indo-Pacific regions. And yeah, I mean, this is also the American strategy right now, that it's about to constrain Russia into outcompeting China. And now that the European defense politics is now totally orientating towards Russia, and we have to manage by ourselves. Of course, with the support of America, but it's our continent.
I'm gonna push you with one more question.
Sure.
If I asked an ordinary supporter of Putin in Russia, if I went to St. Petersburg and I asked an ordinary citizen who supports Putin and supports the special operation, or however he calls the war, what would,
especially military operation,
special military operation, what would he or she tell me is the reason for the invasion of Ukraine, and why is it justified?
Perhaps the Russian propaganda is much about history. The Russians are very obsessed with culture, with a historic responsibility, and they made a lot of comparison towards what the Germans did, for example, in Ukraine. It's about to tackle down the fascist party. It's about, there's a fascist movement there, and the Russian liberators are there for, firstly, to support the Russian minority in Ukraine and to push out the fascists out of this region. Yeah, and it's more like an interstate conflict. It's like they call it special military operation, the Russians, and it's more like an Ukrainian-Russian affair. And the West has different views on that. I mean, Ukraine is part of Europe. It's a neighboring country of Poland. It's very much in the center of Europe, and well, of course, part of the European Union. But in regard of our politics, of how we act and how we live in Europe, side on side, it's totally appropriate to change the status quo, and it's totally inappropriate to use military means with that. Yeah, it's my opinion on that. Yeah.
So I will ask you one more question for the time that we have, if we're already talking about the Ukraine war. You mentioned that Europe needs to stand on its own, and obviously you get support from the US, and we shouldn't doubt that, and we shouldn't look down on that. But that the US, especially under Trump, is becoming more and more isolationist, less and less interested in defending Europe. And what I know as an Israeli is that some European societies are very interested in Israeli weapons, while others are thinking that maybe it's not exactly moral to buy weapons from a country that is engaged in a war that they consider asymmetrical. How do you view this? What is the significance of Israeli defense systems, especially in the defense of Europe these days?
Of course, it plays a very important role, and the Israeli military armament is very good into their drone capacity and their cyber capacity. And we've got a very good exchange programs in military staff and equipment. As long as I know, the IDF or the Navy of the IDF has German submarines, and we have some Israeli drones. And but of course, America is the most important supplier to Israel, and but it's totally true. And you can see it in many European countries that play like a second game, or like a side game. For example, France is very much involved into Lebanon and the Middle East. And of course, they are not selling weapons, but they are very much in charge of, to get their weapons there. And so the French politics is very ambiguous to that. Yeah, perhaps one of the reasons for the recognition of Palestine. But the old empire dreams about France and Britain in the Middle East is something which is still there, not in that amount, but it's an entire competition of each country.
I absolutely agree with you, and now it comes in the form of who is the most decolonial power, which is kind of funny. The point about France, it's funny because there was the whole scandal about France, like French courts banning Israeli companies from displaying weapons on weapon exhibitions, and the justification for that was the war in Gaza. But from what I know, the real reason might have more to do with the fact that France wants to be the next or the biggest exclusive supplier of arms to Europe or to the EU, and it's feeling threatened by the tried and tested systems of Israel that can outflank it.
Totally. I mean, it's international competition, and the Europeans are pretty afraid. Well, especially French are very afraid of losing their contacts and their partners. Yeah, totally. And the kind of colonial behavior towards many countries. France is still, in my eyes, is a colonial power. Well, not colonial power than 6 years ago, but the cultural influence in Lebanon is amazing there. Yeah? There's so many Lebanese who are still studying in France, and even the military deployments in UNIFIL. It's one of the French deployments in Lebanon there. It's still there. So France is totally protecting Lebanon. Not all Lebanese, mostly the Christians, but it's true, yeah. Right, so we have got a category in this wonderful podcast, what we called the Schmutz of a Day. And this category is about the daily most dirty business, what we found on the news. And I want to ask, Amit, so what's your opinion about what's the day of a Schmutz for today? Who's going to get the prize of a Schmutz of a Day?
So, there is a very big scandal going on in Israel at the moment. And I don't think this is actually because it's an internal scandal. It's not something that people quite hear about abroad. I haven't really seen it on international news. But the story is very, very strange. Like all scandals in Israel, it's very strange. And it goes like this. The chief military lawyer of the IDF, about a year ago, she started persecuting soldiers over allegations of torture in one of the detention facilities for detainees that come from Gaza, from the war in Gaza. And as a result of that, she's been facing quite a lot of protests, especially from right-wing activists who are saying, why should you interrogate our own troops while they're doing important work and they're interrogating terrorists or alleged terrorists? Why should you even interfere with what they're doing? And she has been responding with, the fact that Israel is still governed by the rule of law, despite all the efforts to undermine it, and that the rule of law needs to be applied evenly, even when it comes to terrorists. But this did not satisfy the activists that have been knocking on her door and harassing her. And then a few months ago, a video of the torture was leaked, and nobody knew where it came from. Nobody knew who had leaked it. And now it had turned out that the chief lawyer of the IDF herself, she was the leaker of that video. And her point, according to what she's saying, the point was to show the Israeli public what some Israeli soldiers are doing and why there is a need for prosecution. But what happened in practice was that she only gave ammunition to all sorts of lawsuits against Israeli soldiers abroad instead of handling these things domestically and quietly. And now she's standing for trial. And she's not standing for trial for leaking the video. She's standing for trial for lying to the High Court of Justice that she didn't know, or she hadn't known where the video came from, while in fact she was the one who had leaked it. And the most important part is that yesterday night she had gone missing. And there was a pretty big fear for her life. And apparently she tried to commit suicide, but she was found by the Israeli police well and alive, according to them. And now she's in a detention cell. And she's under investigation. And this is definitely one of the weirdest and strangest Schmutz events that have happened in Israel in the last weeks, in the last months, maybe even in the last year. So this is my contender. But maybe, Niklas, maybe you have an even better one.
I wouldn't say I've got a better one, but for my Schmutz of the day, I'm going to nominate Vladimir Putin, because I recently saw an article about the Battle of Pokrovsk. So just for your knowledge, Pokrovsk is a city in the Donetsk region, and the Russian military has intensified his advantages towards the city, and it's a vital transport and logistic hub in Ukraine, and the Ukrainian army say they're capable to hold this city. And yeah, it's horrible what the Russians are doing there. They are targeted this region for more than a year. And I hope so that the Ukrainian military is about to hold this city. So the very reason the Schmutz of the day is the attack of Pokrovsk, and Vladimir Putin has definitely some schmutz on his hands.
Definitely dirty business. And with that being said, we are concluding the first show. Thank you very much for joining us here on the first show of Schmutz. We hope that you enjoyed our content. Obviously, this is all experimental. This is a pilot episode. We will be coming back probably in a week or two with an episode on which topic, Niklas?
I think the next topic is about anti-Semitism. So, as you mentioned, so thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate if you like the podcast. We'll be very happy if you can give us some feedback there. And yeah, I hope you've got a wonderful evening, and see you the next time.